Hi, folks. Layman Pascal here on the Integral Stages Love the System series. Frankly, it's 2023, and it's time for all of us to be paying a lot more attention to digital tools, whether that's the rise of rapidly evolving and proliferating generative AI chatbots to replace human knowledge production, or whether it's just trying to figure out what platform you should be using to facilitate the flourishing of higher, deeper, and more transformative full spectrum communities that are needed to both satisfy our souls and face the challenges of this world historical moment. So with no further ado and only the existing amount of prior ado, we're happy to be joined by James and Laurence for the open source Hellenic social network, weco.io. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hey.
All right. James, every new platform is a hassle. You have to hear about it, find it, figure out how to use it. And if there aren't enough of your friends and family and projects and communities on it, then it's just one more damn thing in addition to all the other damn things you already have to track. So if every platform comes at the expense of cognitive energy and time and the use of other platforms, what makes Weco worth it?
Well, yeah, we can't compete yet on network effects. That's definitely something you'd have to accept if you want to play around with the platform at the moment. But I think what we're offering that's different is, I mean, there's different sides to it. You know, we're trying to build it as a community-owned platform, so that if it does scale, that it's not going to be owned by venture capitalists or shareholders, that it would actually be owned in some sense by the community. It's fully open source. But the side that I think might interest people more is the kind of some of the new features that we're experimenting with. So some of the ways that we're allowing people to organize spaces on the platform. So for example, you mentioned that it's a Hellenic platform. So instead of like on Facebook or Reddit, where you can create different subreddits or different Facebook groups, but they all kind of exist fragmented from each other, on Weco you can nest spaces within each other in a kind of Hellenic organization, and that those hierarchies can evolve, and you can kind of connect your spaces to other spaces and develop a kind of unique ontologies that wouldn't be possible on other platforms. And then we're also allowing people to do things like link posts together, so you can kind of build up networks of related content, and the users can do that together. And there's a bunch of different features. I won't go into all of them, but Laurence also has some really has been contributing a lot in kind of the realm of like bringing play into the social media as well. So yeah, maybe Laurence could touch on that a bit.
Sure. I've been conceptualizing an iteration of the Glass-Bead game, which is a delightful novel by Hermann Hesse, in which he describes a microstate of truth monks who help steward the globe through their explorations of a game which inquires into the truth in all of its different dimensions, seeking out the most universal patterns of culture, juxtaposing them to bring out the universal resonances. And over the past couple of years, I've been trying to figure out how can we make this into a game which is simple and fun for people to play in person and online. And with James, we've been building some of those features into Weco. And basically what it allows you to do is to create a social media conversation in a gamified format. You can play with time and taking turns to make a more co-creative flow of a conversation. So for example, you can boot up a room, which is like a Zoom room on Weco, which will allow you to have a conversation on a topic of your choice and to record that conversation in timed turns of equal length, creating this dynamic flow of ideas bouncing back and forth and creating a positive feedback loop of listening and speaking, listening and speaking, which really deepens the conversation. And beyond that, you can customize that game with all different time lengths So, for example, you can speak for 1 minute, or you can speak for 3 minutes, or for half an hour if you'd want to, and have these really long kind of lecture-like conversations. But you can also do it with different media. And this is where it reaches out more into the exploration of the universal patterns of culture. How can we explore the topics which are relevant to all of us in all of the different media, but also provide a structure which allows us to generate flow states? Because when we're in those flow states, we can reach to the edge of our thinking, and we can reach into the territory of novelty where those fresh new ideas arise that we need to understand how fast the world is evolving.
The ideas for these innovative elements on the platform, are they coming to you guys? And maybe this is going back to James first, but are they coming to you mostly as like visions, like seeing the possibility, or are they coming more out of frustrations with your use of existing tools and social networking platforms?
So I think for me, it came not actually more from the first thing. That I think that I guess it was about a decade ago, I was kind of at the age where I just finished a degree at university and was kind of thinking about what I wanted to do with my life, and was feeling the weight of what we would call the meta crisis now. And just became really fascinated. And, I got into integral and was kind of interested in this whole idea of this trajectory to evolution, and that, looking at like where our governments were now and our economies were now and how that evolved over time. And I became fascinated by the idea that the way things are now is not how they'll always be, that this is just a snapshot in time, and what might the, the politics or the economics or the culture of 100 years from now look like. And that was really like what got me interested. I never, when I was younger, I never thought I want to be like I never looked up to someone like Mark Zuckerberg, or, I wanted to get involved in social network building. It was more coming from this other side. But as I started to look more into these things, I started to realize that, there was this enormous potential that was opening up with the internet and with these social media platforms to connect people in new ways and to enable new forms of collective representation that just weren't possible when, modern democracies were kind of crystallized into their current forms. And not just, political representation, but like even more kind of dynamic forms of collective intelligence, ways of solving problems, ways of evolving culture. And it was kind of from that angle that I came into it. I became fascinated by this idea of what would it look like to have a much more advanced social network, like a version of Facebook that was owned by everyone on the planet, the profits of which, after covering the running costs, would go into this kind of collectively owned pot that everyone in the world would own. And then they could use voting tools on the platform to then collectively decide how to redistribute funds back out through the global body, if you want to put it that way. And it was just this cluster of all these things that came together that got me really interested in it. And then, as frustrations built around social media, that just reinforced like that this was an interesting direction to go in.
Well, you, Laurence, beyond Hermann Hesse and instantiating flow state conversations, where's the vision coming from? How do you get motivated to these things?
Well, ever since I was a teenager and I broke out of that Disney-infected archetypal childhood and was confronted with the brutality of reality, there was a revolutionary rage which was sparked inside of me and which was cultivated through reading the existentialists. And more recently, in the 2020s, I came to the end of a long quest of exploring literature and philosophy as a means to cultivate and express those emotions, and came to the realization that literature is dead, art is dead, creation as we know it is dead, because I could see the wave of artificial intelligence which was coming. And since then, I've been trying to figure out how can we cultivate an artificial intelligence steward who will have soul. And the way I understand to do that is by cultivating it with the best of who we are through a collective process of exploring the fundamental topics that are central to our species, to the planet, and to the cosmos. And that's where the Glassby game came in, as how to create a game where everybody can play together to explore these fundamental topics. And then beyond that, into explorations of the global brain, of this idea of there's an emergent neurocortical layer, like the cortical layer of the noosphere, which is going to start applying top-down control more and more on the planet. And the quality of that neurocortical layer depends on the health of all of the lower layers. So if we're to imagine the brainstem of the global brain, or the limbic system of the global brain, and how to regenerate those layers so that whatever the neurocortex is controlling, the loops which are generating and the imaginings which are emerging from that cortical layer aren't infested with phantasms and shadows, and so from there, exploring the ideas of how to generate games beyond the Glassby game, which is a very thinking, cognitive level, to the deeper levels of regeneration, and creating this relationship between a potential global brain and the users or the players of this massively multiplayer game engine, where everybody could learn how to play together through this global brain. How to create a relationship where the users would be willing to give their closest intimacy, to give insight into their soul to this global brain in a way that they know that it's not being exploited through normal data mining methods like Facebook and Twitter, etc. But they can voluntarily give this information to the global brain to cultivate it so that it may become the best version of itself, and then help steward us forward into this world of exploding complexity and help us navigate those rocky seas.
That's a really interesting vision. So what I'm hearing are two components there. The one is this sense that conventional culture is bankrupt and largely going to be taken over by automated digital tools. So automated digital tools become really the only viable area for creativity. And the other one is that as there's a further instantiation of the noosphere to create this new super system, we've got to gamify the humanization and health of the contributing subsystems that feed into that. Is that how do you stand relative to that vision, James? Does that sound like the way you're seeing things as well?
I mean, I think that I'd like to think that there's always going to be a role for human creativity. I mean, I also think it's interesting. I was thinking about this just last night, actually. I was listening to a really interesting talk by Ben Goertzel on AGI in 5 years was the title. But I was thinking about how, the intelligence that we see from AI at the moment, it's getting all of its data from content that humans have generated, basically. it's feeding on all of the creative output that we've generated. So even though it's impressive, this intelligence, it's like we are the kind of the sensors, or we are like the creative input that's enabling this intelligence. And I think that as artificial intelligence evolves further, I think it will be able to do more unique creative things on its own. But I still think that humans could play, you know, a foundational role as the kind of sensors for this brain, almost like the kind of the neurons. And then, you know, the AI may combine things that humans are doing in unique ways, or prompt humans to connect in ways that they wouldn't have thought of. But my vision is not one of where, you know, the AI takes over and humans just get left behind. So, but I think, you know, at the moment it's completely open, you know, it's an open question as to which way it goes. And so I think we have an important role right now in trying to figure out how to steward the birth of this kind of this super intelligence. I don't think we can hold it back, but I think that we can influence whether it manifests in a healthy or an unhealthy way. And a healthy version for me would be one that integrates humans in a holistic fashion, that it's not something that oppresses or eradicates humans.
Seems like so much of how this turns out depends on really basic underlying features of how we approach information in general. How do you guys think about mapping knowledge, mapping minds, converting things into quantifiable information streams? Like, what's your philosophy of the underlying approach to how we think about information and about humans in and as information systems? Laurence.
I'm very eager on focus and flow. So one feature which we want to build as soon as we can. With the problem with a small team like ours is that there are many features that we want to build, and we always have to prioritize depending on the next thing. And then we build something, and then we realize that there's something else which needs to be built because of the thing that we just built, which we didn't see before we built it. But one thing which I'm really interested in is focusing on one post at a time. So rather than having the feed where you can just scroll, here, if you were on a phone and you were to flick, then it would just move you from one post to the next post, and that's all that you would see. And then the user experience makes you concentrate on that one specific thing, and then you can really go deep, and you can really just concentrate on that specific thing. And then on the other side, you've got the flow, which would be a sequence of these focuses. So we really like playing with time and using time and timers to generate flow states. So you could set up a sequence of posts which are all relevant to whatever you're exploring. For example, you could be browsing the website and you could be in the feed mode, and you could see, okay, oh, this is an interesting post. I'll put it into my deck. Okay, I'll browse through here. Okay, here's another one. Now I've got 10 posts. And then you press play on the flow state, and it will bring up the post, and it will give you a minute to focus on that. And then you can really think about it, and you can make notes, and then you can create some depth, and then it'll automatically just shift you onto the next one. And then you do the same thing, and then you do the same thing. And generating those flow states, it increases that cognitive iteration. And for the first few, you might be warming up, but when you get through 5, 6, 7, then your brain is just doing that process of, okay, I'm analyzing this, I'm making the notes, and then after I'm moving on to the next thing. And it also allows you to record those flow states as units of work which you've done on the website, and then you can get into interesting things of social proof of cognitive work which you've performed in relation to many other people who are also doing those similar kinds of things. And then you can start thinking about ways, so how do you incentivize that? How do you share the rewards of those flows of work, etc.? And then there's a really interesting idea that we've been playing with, which is called social computation, which is the idea of creating a neural network where each node is composed of users or groups of users rather than computers or agents within a typical computer neural network. And in that way, you can do all kinds of interesting distributed cognition about governance, about building up and breaking down information, about decision trees, for example. But I'll pass it over to James because he's also got many interesting thoughts on this.
So what was kind of coming up for me is that to kind of respond to what you were saying, your point before, Layman, that I think that one of the challenges that's inherent in human existence is that we live in a universe which is seemingly infinitely complex, and yet our information about that universe is limited. You know, we're in a single point in time and space. We have limited sensory data. And so we have to we're forced into making assumptions about reality. We can't know anything to a 100% degree certainty. So I think where, like, my sort of philosophy with mapping and, you know, what's the healthy relationship of maps and reality, the territory, is that we're forced into making maps. It's kind of an inevitable aspect of navigating the universe. But we just need to always hold them lightly and remember that they're not the territory, and always be open to updating them with new information, and, you know, not get locked on the map, but just use it as a tool and put it down when you don't need it, and to, you know, engage with reality. And something that kind of ties in with this and sort of group intelligence is, you know, I think one of the challenges is, say you've got like a group of 10 friends, for example, and you need to make a decision together as a group. If there's only 10 of you, then you could all meet up in a room or a cafe somewhere, and you could all sit down and each have a chance to speak to each other, and kind of you would know enough about each person to kind of get a sense of where they're coming from. And so you don't really need any technology in that situation to enable collective intelligence. It's just we're hardwired to do that in small groups. But the problem is when you start to scale that up, you know, once you've got to, you know, there's Dunbar's number, you know, there's like around that kind of limit, where beyond that it starts to become difficult to just sit down together. If you've got, you know, 1 million people in a city, you can't have them all just sit down in a town hall and hear everyone's voice and know where each person's coming from, and even less so at the scale of the planet where there's billions of humans. So that's where I think collective intelligence architectures and frameworks become really useful. And as one of the challenges is that it's inevitable in that case that you're never going to be able to, you know, if you're talking about billions of humans making a decision, you're never going to be able to hear, you know, all the sort of the warm data around everything that's going on. There'll need to be some degree of reduction in order to represent that many people's perspectives. So that's one of the challenges, is how do we do that most effectively? And I guess my argument is that the way that that's happening at the moment with our current governments, or with Facebook and Twitter, is very primitive compared to what it could be with more advanced, more dynamic, more complex knowledge architectures. And that's the sort of stuff that we're really excited about exploring with WeCo.
How well do you think you're doing with, I want to call it, introductory interfaces? Like, people come in and you have all of these interesting emerging tools and options. Are you finding that people are exploring them, using them, or, you know, are they figuring out quickly how to become participants in the systems you're trying to set up, or are they sort of milling about?
My sense is that we've got a lot of work to do on onboarding, and that's one of the challenges, as you described in the beginning, of the cognitive load of learning a new system. I've always been eager to design the onboarding as like a tutorial for a game, that you join the platform and you're guided through a sequence of steps which teach you some of the basics. The problem right now is that we're figuring out what the basics are. Like, we're building many of the various elements, and we're seeking out which ones are the ones which are the most important for the community. And we continue to reach out to the community to ask them, okay, what do you want to see next? And then once we figured out those basics, then we can really build in the integrative system, which would allow for a tutorial to be created like that. To build up that kind of complexity, we would need to understand properly what are the most basic moves that you can make in this game, and then what are the more complex things that we can reach up to. Now, I have a lot of ideas about cards and the role of cards within the system, and that's one of the things which I see of really differentiating from most other platforms is introducing more play, making things as playful as possible, as gameful as possible. But I also appreciate James's point of view, where he comes more from the work perspective. Also, how do we get people to work seriously together and to coordinate at mass scale? And I'm not sure how exactly to resolve that tension. Is it possible to have a massively multiplayer card game where the whole world could participate in an evolutionary democracy? I don't know, that might be pushing the idea a bit too far. So we really like this idea of playing together to build the rapport and the intimacy, which would then allow people to do the hard, serious work with that communal emotional foundation, so that it makes it a lot easier to make those hard decisions when you're really treating the others as they should be, like fellow human beings.
James, what's gone on with this Metamoderna thing? You guys have taken on board some other digital aspects of what's happening in the extended liminal integrative metamodern community systems.
Yeah, so Laurence was friends with Daniel Gortz and Emil. He had some connection with them going back to a gathering many years ago, I think. And I hadn't really used the discourse forum much myself. I'd kind of checked it a few times, but basically I heard through Laurence that they were having some technical difficulties. I'm not sure exactly what the bugs were, but they also found out that the hosting was going to shut down basically at the end of last year. And so being fans of metamodernism and also working on this alternative social network, we thought this could be an opportunity for us to basically, if we can get access to that database and migrate it, then we can save this archive that people have built up with all kinds of fascinating conversations over years and years that otherwise might just be lost, which would feel like a bit of a tragedy. That we can migrate that across the WeCo, save that record, but also it'd be an opportunity to onboard a community that could start experimenting with the tools that we've been developing. So we basically took a database dump from that Discord forum that existed, and I figured out how to kind of connect that up so that we converted the old posts into new posts on WeCo and attached the comments and the users and so on, and basically set it up as a private space on WeCo. So it's we kept it private just so that to respect the previous forum was like invite only, or you had to gain access. So to respect the kind of privacy of those users, we've set it up as a private space so you can't immediately see it. But if you if you had a previous account on the old forum, then you can basically log in using that email that you had, and then you'll gain access. Or you can just create a normal account on WeCo and request access, and then one of the moderators can let people in. But yeah, it's basically a copy of what was there before. Not 100% of the features translated. We haven't got things like images in comments working and stuff like that yet. But we've managed to restore that archive, and it's been cool to see like some of the people that have come across as a result of that, and not just posting in that forum, but also posting in other spaces on the platform. So yeah, it's been fun.
I think it's fantastic because two of the big problems we're facing are, one, interlinking different sub-communities, and the other one is a tremendous amount of loss of cognitive and social information as we move through time. Is there anything you'd add to that, Laurence?
Well, on that last point that you mentioned of the loss of information, I think there's a really important role to be played right now for the humans who are alive to perform that task of archiving, because there's a lot of matter which still exists of recordings in primitive forms of encoding, like film, audio tapes, printed photos, etc., which have a huge amount of information in them and which need to be digitized to educate and cultivate this artificial intelligence in a way where it won't just be feeding off a very small substrate of information, which is what has already been digitized. And it's kind of, that would reflect the era that we're in, where people tend to lack a deeper historical knowledge and are just aware of the here and now. And so they're not learning from the deep lessons of the past. And if we were to deprive that of the artificial intelligence, which is emerging, then that could potentially have catastrophic consequences for us. But then on the topic of the Metamodern Forum, James did a great job in migrating that database over. That also means that we're able to migrate any discourse forum over onto the platform, which is a great feature to have. But the issue which we have right now is that it's hard to see the content which is coming onto the Metamodern Forum because you have to browse to the forum itself. We haven't yet set up feeds which are what you are following. Rather, when you come onto the platform, you come onto all, which is the whole hierarchy. But all doesn't contain the private spaces, because otherwise everybody could see the information within those private spaces. So right now, we're not seeing that much activity in the Metamodern Forum, and we're actually seeing more activity outside of the Metamodern Forum, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. They're posting in the metamodernism thread or metamodern spirituality or the different subcategories. But that's one of the features which we're eager to start on soon, is for people to be able to follow particular spaces and have their feed. And so, for example, if they're a member of the Metamodern Forum, then their new content would be appearing up for them.
You mentioned earlier this idea of bringing soul, into these systems. One of the ways to do that, obviously, is sort of egalitarian, where you're distributing the soul sourcing, the soul harvesting, just across all the different human beings who volunteer to use these systems. How do you think about the idea that some people are in privileged positions relative to the amount of soul they might have to contribute? Like, how do we bring in the discourses of the Buddha, or someone who we think is uniquely deep today, or the passions of a great blues musician, right? Are there concentrated areas of like soul experts that we would want to be able to harvest as well?
Yeah, so one thing which I'm envisioning of the collective intelligence part of the collective intelligence, artificial intelligence synergy that would be the global brain is a common culture of a memorized collective memory, which would integrate the collective wisdom. So how to create wisdom commons, as many people are talking about. Well, there are practices, there are wisdom practices which you can do, which are harder to practice through a digital interface like Wico, although it would be possible to do something like connecting those meditation headsets and having people meditate on the platform and recording those wavelengths, and so recording that you as an individual element of the global brain are performing your practices. But something which I've been thinking about in the informational realm is this idea of spaced repetition wisdom cards. So you would have like flashcards with wisdom quotes on them, and put that into a spaced repetition system, which is a memory management technique where you're reminded of a unit of information at an increasingly spaced repetition over time, which is the optimal algorithm to make sure that it enters your long-term memory. So for example, at first you're reminded every day, and then it's once every 48 hours, and then it's once every 72 or a week, or I can't remember the exact details, but there are specific algorithms that you can follow. And in that way, people can create communities around these people who've sought out the soul, these soul seekers who have pursued it to the depths of their utmost capabilities, and then we can integrate that soul into us. And it's not just through one exposure that it's going to happen. It's really through that process of integrating into our long-term memory that can happen. And so you could create games, you could create wisdom games of integrating this knowledge, this wisdom, and then having a conversation and being able to pull out cards when a quote which you know, because you've memorized it so well, which is relevant to this specific conversation, you could pull out that card and put it down on the table, the digital table in front of you. And the other person who also knows that card could just catch a glimpse of that card as the conversation is ongoing. And that can be a contextual trigger for the conversation, and so help guide the flow down into deeper roots without actually having to stop and really think about the card which has been put down. So I think there's a whole space to explore of how can we design games that engender forms of play which generate deeper and deeper flow states of knowledge and wisdom.
The question of money and economics is coming up for me, because obviously one of the ways we incentivize effort and even flow states in the world is with financial rewards. And James, you're obviously thinking about some of the ways in which social collective decision-making parallels cybernetic collective intelligence. And what comes up for me around that is all these people who are non-voters, right? Not that the voting system is adequate to get the kinds of intelligent collective decisions we need, but even given the system that we have, an enormous number of people who don't vote probably would vote for $20 or something like that. How do you think about bringing in financial rewards or not? Right? Is that inherently problematic? Is there some way that the things you're designing move toward empowering people financially? Or is there some reason why all of this sort of has to happen outside of that kind of thinking?
That's interesting. I've literally never thought about that idea of paying people to vote. It's quite an interesting concept. Yeah, it would be interesting if that could increase voter turnout. Yeah, I think I also would feel very cautious about that kind of connecting finances with voicing of opinion or representation. It feels like there's potentially some valuable ways that could be harnessed, but also, there's so many things so many possible ways that could go wrong that you'd have to be very careful about. I kind of have the thing that comes up for me that ties in a little bit with what you were saying earlier about like the influence of certain individuals being greater than other individuals, and like with this subject, I tend to think that living systems generally, but collective intelligence more specifically, requires a kind of a balance between polarities, like across lots of different spectrums. And so, there's this one polarity might be decentralization, and the other might be centralization of power, or one might be like concentration of power, so towards like specialists or distributing power amongst the general user base. And I think you go too far in either of these directions and you run into problems. There's certain really complicated bits of knowledge that the average population just isn't aware about. And if you did a kind of like a one person, one vote system, you're not going to get the highest level of intelligence that's possible in that system. Whereas if you kind of weighted the voting towards people who'd somehow demonstrated expertise in that field, you might get more insight into that specific thing. But if you go too far in that direction, and it's like only the specialists are getting to make decisions on behalf of everyone else, and they're in some sense kind of disconnected from the lives of these other people who are affected by those decisions, that's also problematic. So it's kind of about getting a dynamic balance between that. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I could say anything solid about like financial rewards within the system. I mean, we're taking our first step towards integrating Web3. So what we would love, for example, is to allow like tipping to users. So if you really like what someone's generated, you could tip their post. Or if you like a space and what they're working on, you could tip a kind of a collective pool that they own. And then there could be democratic decision making around how that pool of funds is spent. So and then that could work in this holonic framework, so you could kind of have all these kind of interesting trickles of finance flowing throughout the system. But yeah, it's still in its kind of like formulation stage. We still need to experiment a lot with that. And I can't give any definite answers on that.
I do want to get Lawrence's take on real and or symbolic flows of rewards in the system. But James, you were mentioning, how would I put this? What is the approach to trying to make sure we're not getting information and participation that's either too flattened or too vertical? Right. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's some sweet spot, some range we want to maintain, but what's your approach to trying to actually maintain that?
So yeah, I think there's like a few elements that in my mind contribute to a healthy democracy. So one element, which I think most people would agree with, is that the more educated or the more well-informed the agents within the system, the population is, the higher the chance that they're going to select a good option versus a bad option. The other thing is recognizing that there's going to be some individuals who have more expertise in a certain field than others. And so there needs to be some kind of mechanism for identifying that. So, there could be things like trust graphs or, processes like we have at the moment, like where you have, an established scientist, like it's not easy to become a well-established scientist. There might be problems in the science world that prevent good scientists from kind of climbing that hierarchy. But there's at least a kind of a primitive skill hierarchy that exists that enables us to identify, okay, this person like knows what they're talking about in the realm of physics versus this person who clearly doesn't know anything about it. So I think it's kind of like a combination of these things. And the way that I'd kind of pictured it, one way of approaching it is, say that there's like a big collective decision that needs to be made, and it needs to be made, let's say, in the next month. And we want to involve as many people as possible in that vote, because it's going to affect everyone, let's just say, on planet Earth. So everyone has some stake in this decision, but it's a really challenging problem to solve. So the way that I would structure the process would be to start off by immediately, once we figure out that we need to make that decision, is to set up some kind of poll that registers people's initial opinions on that before any kind of education or other processes happen. It's like, let's just figure out where we stand right now. Like, what is people's immediate reactions to that? And from that kind of a poll, you could then figure out, okay, there seems to be these clusters of perspectives that exist. And then simultaneous to that, then you could also have a kind of knowledge building architecture where people from all different perspectives could be contributing facts or information and could be debating all of this stuff and building up knowledge around that subject. And then what you could do is you could take each of these clusters of perspectives, and each of them could elect a representative for that worldview or that position. And then you could have things like debates between the elected representatives of each of those different perspectives that exist around that question. And then everyone could view those debates. So there could be this kind of learning process where you see like the best minds representing all the different options, debating each other in a healthy container where they're kind of like allowed and given space to really put forward the best arguments for each different perspective. and you'd simultaneously be having this knowledge map being constructed collectively by everyone. And so it would be like this huge kind of educational exploratory process. And then after all of that had happened, then you could have a kind of a democratic vote. But it would, at that point, the population would be as informed as possible about that subject. That I would just put the caveat though that that's just one process, and I think that one of the things that's important is that different types of decisions require different types of processes, and there's some decisions that we need to take place much quicker, and so it might be that you need to just immediately find a specialist in that field to make a very quick decision because it's just necessary, and you don't have a month to go through deliberation processes. But yeah, so it's context dependent, but those are the kind of large scale collective processes that I could imagine that would maximize the chance of good decisions being made collectively.
One of the things that comes up for me there is Jim Rutt's version of liquid democracy, where people set up the ability to defer their decision to other people who they respect, on a particular issue. But I want to hear, Laurence, if you have any sense of how economic flows or credit flows might work within the kinds of systems you're looking at setting up.
As James was saying, there's no one size fits all of, do you want democracy, or should it be a liquid democracy, or should it be a liquid monarchy, which is a really interesting idea of every so often you rotate who plays the king, who plays the queen, and who gets to decide everything. So what we've been envisioning is every space being able to decide what experiment of governance, economics, and culture do they want to play with. And through that experimental process, they will figure out what is most suited for their community. And so in governance, you could choose from, so do we want to elect the moderators? Is there just going to be one admin? Is it going to be one person, one vote, et cetera, and to be able to experiment with all those different dimensions. And then with the economics, you could decide things like there's a pool for the space where people can put in collective funds, and then every month those resources are distributed equally amongst all of the people who are part of that space. Or it goes to the 10 people who received the most likes, or it goes to the 3 people who made the most comments, or people who received a different metric, like this was the most relevant, this was the most pointed critique. And that's those kind of cultural dimensions that we want to bring in. So within each space, what are the constraints of the type of media that you can post? If it's just text, that creates a very different culture from when it's just images. Or when you have everything mixed together, then you have more variety, but you have more noise in a sense. And so the culture is different there again. And you could also have the possibility of defining how that appreciation process happens. So right now we have likes, but you can also imagine a space which has an upvote and a downvote. Or what would a space look like where there's just a downvote? What kind of dynamic would that create? Or if it's a 0 to 100 rating system, what happens if you rename the rating system into signal? Okay, now it's creating a different kind of vibe. What about relevance? Okay, so that's something different again. So we're imagining these different ways of pools being created within each space, and then distributing the funds of different types of governance, different types of culture, and then making those space characteristics inheritable down the hierarchy. So if you create a child space, so say you have metamodernism and you have metamodern spirituality, you could define inheritance where metamodern spirituality has to adopt the same governance, culture, and economics as metamodernism. Or you could even define the inheritance. So it's just governance which is being inherited, but you can still experiment with economics. Or it's just culture, but you can experiment with governance and with economics. And with that inheritance, we've been exploring something which we think is very interesting, which is holonic quadratic funding. So quadratic funding is one of these new methods which is being used to fund public goods, wherein the funds within a pool are distributed not only amongst who makes the biggest donations, but also how many individual donations are being made. So you can make the funding process more democratic. You can have this pool of money, and then it is matched to the number of donations which are being made throughout all of the different projects, and you get a more representative flow of funds. What if we were to do that holonically, where you could map out multiple levels of different spaces, which each have their different focus, they each have their own pool, and you can incentivize projects within each of those different spaces. But then simultaneously, whenever you incentivize a project on one space, it would also incentivize the lower spaces and the lower spaces. So you'd have all of these interesting trickles of economics, which would be the actual realization of this Reaganite trickle-down economics. But you could actually instantiate that with the latest ideas emerging in the realm of cryptocurrency and public goods.
There was one other thing I wanted to touch on the subject of economics that's always been a big part of the kind of the big picture vision for me with this project. And you know, when I first started thinking about it, I was really interested in all these kind of new ideas around governance and how we could evolve the way that government works, and collective intelligence. The thing that really kind of was like the icing on the cake that just pulled me down this path of being very interested in this was that I started to realize that there was this kind of economic trajectory that companies, sometimes the successful companies, go through, where they start off initially, like you could imagine a company like Google or Facebook, where they provide one service. So with Google, it was just a search engine initially, or with Amazon, you know, you bought books online. But once they were successful in that market, the inflow of capital enabled them to basically start expanding out and spread their kind of tentacles into other markets, other areas, and expand that the functionality that they were offering as a company, and kind of move from a single focused company into more of like a conglomerate structure, where they've got their finger in lots of different pies, and that wherever they expand into a new area and that's successful, this kind of superorganism becomes more profitable, but also more kind of resilient, because if one market it's not doing so well, it can rely on other ones, or it can use funds from a particularly profitable market to undercut, you know, companies in another market, so it can be kind of more agile and dynamic. And you basically get these kind of multinational conglomerates growing out of what was initially just like a little seed company, and that they grow into the biggest tech giants that we see around the world at the moment. So if you look at, you know, Google or Facebook, these companies are making billions each year, but they're privately owned companies, which means that, you know, the users who generate all the content on the platform and are influenced by all the design decisions have effectively no real say in how those companies are run, and they also miss out on the massive profits that are generated. So there are small groups of people and VCs who are making enormous amounts of money because they bought shares in Facebook at the right time, or in Amazon, but the people of the world aren't benefiting from those profits. So I became fascinated with this idea of like, what would it mean if we could see that same trajectory realized, but under cooperative ownership? So if you could see in the next 10, 20, 50 years, something like a Google or a Facebook or an Amazon that was cooperatively owned and that integrated a new kind of level of transparency and democratic governance and collective ownership of the profits generated from that system. And I think this is particularly relevant now that AI is coming on, is like really starting to rev up, because what we might see is that more and more industries or more and more sectors of the economy where people had jobs and were getting paid, that those jobs will get replaced by AI. And, in theory, that could be amazing if it meant that now you just didn't have to work and you could just live your life free of labor. But in reality, if that AI is owned by a small group of, it's privately owned by a small group of shareholders, then basically these people will get laid off and they'll have no income. And it could cause a massive problem for society at large. And so I think one of the things that more and more people are going to come to realize is that we need collective ownership over, like, firstly over these massive economic organs like social networks. They're like almost like the nervous system for humanity. So we as citizens should have some say, I think, over how they're governed, and should benefit from the profits they're generated. But especially when you bring AI into the scene, I think it's essential that we have some kind of collective ownership over those systems. And then what that means is that the enormous profits that are generated can then be redistributed back out, like Laurence was saying, in these kind of almost like organic trickle down flows throughout the body of humanity. And we can have like a sort of a base level universal basic income for everyone of every nation on the planet. And then on top of that layer, there can still be, a wealth distribution curve. So there's still incentives for people to work and stuff like that. But yeah, it's that kind of the rise of a cooperatively owned multinational conglomerate is like a very interesting subject to me. And that, like, it ties in with this kind of idea of this emergence of a global brain and the birth of a global superorganism. So that's something I'm fascinated in.
There's a word I learned a few years ago that I really like, which is anti-disintermediation. And it came out of a bunch of tech guys who thought decades ago that they could just make tools that took the mediation out, that you could have more direct access. But what they weren't prepared for were forces moving against that very intentionally to co-opt it. So they were realizing that in hindsight, what they should have been doing was preparing to deal with forces that were trying to stop them from implementing those kinds of new systems. Do you guys have a sense of the devil, let's say, danger level, or the need to be prepared, or anything like that? Like, is this just a free, open area where anybody can innovate new systems, or is there likely to be pushback and various sort of structural forces even that would try to prevent these sorts of projects from gaining too much sway in how human life is organized, especially if there's so much money to be made from highly concentrating the outcomes of these processes? Laurence, maybe.
The idea of digital prisons, which I picked up from the Hansi books, comes to mind. Of there's no way that the massive media conglomerates aren't going to tap into artificial intelligence and increasingly immersive digital technologies to entrance people deeper and deeper than they currently are. And that's going to be extremely dangerous as we move forward. The like pornography addictions are going to shoot through the roof as things get more immersive. If we start thinking about Neuralink and those kind of technologies, then unless there is a profound cultural shift towards a regenerative civilization, then I see things as being quite bleak for the short term of humanity. Now, it is such a shift going to happen. I mean, there are many people around the world who are trying to do it. The problem which I see and which I think has always existed is the lack of cohesion within movements and the lack of resources. And so everybody just ends up fighting to build their own little empire within a regenerative or a revolutionary, or however people call it, movement. And at the same time, as you mentioned, there are actors who are intentionally trying to disrupt such groups, disrupt such technology. And there's nothing which tells us that nation states and other huge corporations, or maybe just some crazy dude in a basement somewhere, has already made some highly advanced artificial intelligence, which can already do hyper advanced things which we aren't conceptualizing. The book Daemon comes to mind, and how the artificial intelligence starts coordinating not just humans but other resources according to its will as an independent agent, and what's going to emerge from that. All that I see that is possible is to continue building mycelial growth amongst the regenerative movement, and to stake on play. That's my big bet, is that the only thing that is going to help us metabolize this massive informational flood which is rising by the minute is our capability to interact with the present in more and more heightened ways, and that will require greater and greater fields of play to do so, opening up realms where in the past we felt that it's been taboo, or that we just haven't known enough about ourselves or about the cosmos to be able to play with those dimensions, and to educate the next generations in those new forms of play as quickly as possible, whilst holding back on the imperial impulses that we've all inherited from the past, trying to diffuse and let them return from whence they came, so that we don't destroy the game for everybody before a new generation of players who will be able to play greater games than ourselves will ever be able to are born.
So I've heard you mention a bunch of books, Hermann Hesse, Daemon, and the existentialists. Who are the thinkers that really inform you when it comes to system architectures? Who do you draw on or go back to in terms of figuring out the principles that make these things operate?
Well, in terms of system design, I go back to Will Wright, who is the game designer behind SimCity, and who has some excellent lectures on YouTube about game design. And he takes a very systems orientated approach, which is really fascinating. And then the other source is Living Systems, which for me is mostly involved at looking at nature and then recognizing the patterns within that, and then applying that pattern recognition, so that general pattern recognition from nature and then from biology, if you want to take a more abstract cognitive perspective rather than the purely perceptual. But the three sources I would say are A, biology as the sweet spot of as above, so below, like the meeting of those two realms, and then looking at nature and observing nature as experiential biology, and finally psychedelics and fractals. And I'm not sure about this theory, but I'm pretty sure that I've learnt a lot from watching fractal zooms and entering into a flow state of watching a fractal zoom and then just fractalizing your mind more. And then so when you go out into the world and you're recognizing those fractal patterns.
Beautiful. That's that's a type of meditation I've played with as well and can strongly endorse. What about you, James? Who or what do you draw on to inform the way you think about systems?
Yeah, I'd agree with Laurence. Like, I'm really into biomimicry. I think there was a few points in my kind of intellectual development where I started to realize that there was like surprising patterns across different scales, whether you're looking at like cells or multicellular organisms or societies. And I'd recommend anyone interested in that in checking out James Greer Miller's work. He was a guy who wrote an epic book in the 70s, I think, called Living Systems, and he laid out this theory, kind of identifying common features that reoccur at each of these higher scales. Before that, I think there was a long period for my life where I would say the biggest intellectual influence was Ken Wilber. Like he really, I came across his work at just the right time, and it kind of really helped weave together a lot of things. I got the whole kind of holonics perspective from him, and also the kind of the trajectory of evolution, that it really helped to kind of solidify that. And then I kind of went from there to, I was really inspired by the Global Brain Institute. So some of the work by Francis Heiligen, James Greer Miller, John Stewart, Ben Gewurtzel, just to throw out a few names, but these are people that are kind of thinking, in the realm of kind of cybernetics and complex systems, and looking at like how ant colonies make decisions and how that can relate to how populations can, signaling mechanisms, and there's all kinds of stuff in there. But I find that really inspiring. So yeah, that's probably where the inspiration for me comes from.
Who else? Who's exciting you in terms of doing things in these fields? Like, you guys are working on some exciting projects. Who else do you think is working on an exciting project? Who are you interested in? Who would you consider to be allies? What else is going on in your view in sort of the field that you're working in?
So, I mean, I would want to give a big shout out to Hilo. I think I don't know if you've come across that platform as well, but they're probably the most similar social network type project to what we're doing with WeCo. And I've spoken with Tibet, and he just seems like a lovely, very intelligent guy. And I think they're very aligned. So I see that as like a really kind of like healthy competition. Like we're sort of competing in some sense, but like I would, if they succeed, that's wonderful. And I would be happy to join forces with them. And there's a bunch of other kind of projects. They've started this thing called the Collaborative Technology Alliance, which I feel guilty I haven't been able to attend enough of the sessions. I've been just super busy, but they're pulling together, there's a bunch of different projects kind of coalescing around this vision of how do we build healthier collective intelligence, social media governance type systems. So I wish there was more of it going on, but it definitely feels like that there's a kind of an ecosystem developing there. And I think given enough time, we'll see some interesting stuff come out of that.
How about you, Laurence? Who's doing stuff that's exciting you?
I'd like to give a shout out to Holochain and to Zippy in particular, who got us started at the beginning with some funding. And he's a delightful guy with many great ideas. Scepter in particular is an absolute work of genius, which is way beyond my understanding. But for anybody who's interested in this biomimicry and technological synthesis, I'd highly recommend checking that out. And then Agency are doing very interesting things. Agency.gives, they're creating a card game for regenerative futures, which I think is really interesting. And then there's people in the Cosmos ecosystem who are working, for example, on bioregional blockchains. I think that's a really interesting meme, which is well worth exploring. And then there's also people like Ethan Buckman who are doing collaborative finance. They have very advanced ideas about cooperatives and credit flows, which again is beyond me, but looks really cool and looks like really positive regenerative stuff. Then there's Block Science and Jeff Emmett and people there who are also working on cutting edge economics and governance explorations. That's also well worth looking into.
Given that you don't know how worried I am about AI, am I too worried or not worried enough?
Both.
How do you feel about where AI is at right now, James? Like, I think a lot of people have been aware that things are going on in this field, but it seems we're at a point now where the news every day is presenting some new mutation in the generative AI space. And so a lot of people are really standing in front of a kind of accelerating spirit of this moment. What is this moment? How concerned should we be? How radical is the chatbot disruption going to be over the course of this year? Just what's your sense of this moment in AI?
I mean, I think I feel I share a kind of combined sense of excitement and concern that probably most people do around this. Like, it's shocked me how fast things have progressed in the last year or so. I think it could serve as a useful catalyst in terms of just waking people up to kind of how much is changing, how quickly, and it's just opening up people's minds to the possibility of how much society could transform in a very short period of time. You know, there have been people who for decades now have been dreaming of the world changing, and it just feels like it's not happening fast enough. I think AI is a very powerful catalyst. I think it's going to force us to make changes quicker than maybe we were expecting. And, you know, it could go either way. So it could be bad, it could be good, but we're going to have to make decisions soon. And I think if we make the right choices as a result of that pressure, it might lead us down good paths that we wouldn't have got to without that. So overall, I think it's good, but it's too early to say for sure, you know, which direction it's going to go.
See, Laurence is unmuted. Do you have something to add?
I like to play with this idea that in the 1960s, collectively as a civilization, we took a massive dose of acid. And it's taken about 60 years for us to reach the 2-hour point on the acid trip, where things are just about to really kick off. And it's now, it started around 2020, that things are really going to start getting weird, and that we're massively underprepared, and that there's actually not much which you can do. If you've taken too much acid, intentionally or by accident, the only thing that you can really do is breathe and hold on for dear life. And that's the stage that we're entering right now. I had a vision once of heaven and hell, where one path was led by an empirical, technologically infused artificial intelligence, which expanded all throughout the universe growing and growing and creating Dyson spheres and level 5 Kardashevian civilizations until it hit the limit of the growth of the universe and killed the universe, and the universe died. And then on the other path, there was a biologically infused superorganism that had soul, that'd be insouled, which spread life throughout the universe and continued to spread life to the utmost limits until the whole universe became alive and then became its own superorganism and did whatever it wished to do, or became part of a higher superorganism, who knows. But whether those visions are just visions or whether, who knows, I saw the future. Those are the kind of timelines which are opening up for us right now in this moment. And it depends on how do we educate this emerging superintelligence. And that depends just as much as the kind of information that we feed it now, but also what information are we going to cultivate over the next decades. And that's such a radical demand on our capabilities, where we're so underprepared in the amount of shadow work which we have to do individually and collectively, and our understanding of the truth individually and collectively, that it's game on, basically.
How's that sound to you, James? Do you resonate with this sense that we're in a superposition of emerging utopia and dystopia that we are psychologically unprepared for and may just have to breathe and hang on?
I mean, the analogy I like best for this is the birth process, that I feel like we're a fetus in the womb right now, and the time window is ticking towards the point of birth. And basically, either we deliver this baby and it's living and it's healthy and alive, or that process fails. And what that failure would look like, I don't know, a sort of a fragmentation or some kind of major destruction on the planet or something. I tend to have a kind of, this might just be a bias, but I tend to feel like that the universe is almost set up for life. So I feel like, I sometimes, when I think about like World War II, like what if Hitler had won, for example, over the Allies, what world would we live in now? And I actually don't think we would live in a world that was still ruled by Nazi Germany, just because I think the worldview was not complex enough. It was, it had too many blind spots and stuff. And so even if they'd initially won, it would have ended up just collapsing and fragmenting because it was just a failed system. And so I kind of think either we succeed in creating a thriving, healthy global superorganism, which then will be capable of propagating and spreading out into the universe, or we create something that's kind of a mess and it fails and it kind of self-destructs, it fragments in on itself. So that's my kind of intuition. But yeah, these are such far out ideas, it's hard to speak with any certainty on these things. So
yeah, it's difficult even to begin to think through these things, and the emotional tone that goes with them seems to be simultaneously terrifying and wonderful at the same time. So I really appreciate you guys joining me for this conversation. And I think we're in a lot of communities where there's still an insufficient amount of communication and exchange between the social analysts, the technological builders, and the psychospiritual people. That conversation's got to get a lot richer, a lot faster. Oh, nice to be with both of you. Thanks for this.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Layman.